Welcome to KAC and the Fulbright Forums. Tonight, Ms. Dorry Guerra, one of our esteemed junior researchers, will present her work on the ways in which native Koreans perceive the identity of multiracial and multicultural Koreans. In the context of her research, native refers to Koreans who are both racially and ethnically Korean. More specifically, Dorry is looking at the roles of heritage, physical looks, and language abilities in a native Korean's interpretation of multiracial and multicultural Koreans. Along with her research in Korea, Dorry is doing a parallel study in the United States. She hopes that this comparative study will shed light on the understanding and definition of Americanness and Koreanness. Dorry's research will help distinguish what qualities are weighed most heavily by Koreans in determining the identity of those who are traditionally considered others. Dorry is a recent graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, where she focused on visual studies. Her current research is done in connection with Yonsei University. Dorry's research interests include multiculturalism and multiracialism, particularly through psychological lens. Her current work is relevant to psychology as well as social well-being and acceptance in Korean society. Now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dorry Guerra to the front.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much to Fulbright for putting on tonight's event. Can everyone hear me? Is that okay? Okay. So, as was just introduced, I'm a recent graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, and I currently conduct my research at Yonsei University's Social and Cultural Psychology Lab. So, in a nutshell, I'm interested in two things. One, I'm interested in how Koreans think about Koreanness as a specific racial category, and then I'm interested in how Koreans think about racial categories more broadly or more generally. So, let me kick this off by asking if you consider this person to be Korean. Okay? And what about this person? Finally, what about this person? Same person. Actually, a different person. So, when you're answering this question, what you're going off of is solely visual information, right? So you're looking at this person's phenotypic features, or what I call mixed information, right? Because all you see here is an image. But what if I were to explicitly tell you that one of this person's biological parents is Korean, and that the other is not Korean, and thereby give you information about this person's ancestral heritage, or what I call blood information? Moreover, what if I were to tell you that this person is a native speaker of Korean, and thereby give you language information? So the profile of this fictional person I just presented is actually likely to represent a member of one of Korea's most fastest growing and salient minority groups, and that is the so-called 다문화 or multicultural population. Now, these individuals, these 다문화 individuals, usually come from Korean fathers, usually men from rural farming areas, and mothers from countries like China, or various Southeast Asian countries, and now increasingly countries from Northern Eurasia, right? So places like Russia and Kazakhstan. So their numbers were such that in 2010, 1 in 3 babies being born were considered multicultural. And moreover, demographers predict that by the year 2050, 10% of the Korean population will be multicultural. Is that echo okay? Is that bothering you? Should I put it down? Is it okay? Sorry about that. So these multicultural individuals are very fast-growing population. And it is through these individuals and other multiracial individuals, or those who are traditionally considered other, that I wish to kind of understand this notion of Koreanness. So I'm particularly interested in the interaction between these three variables, that is blood, looks, and language. Now, as Mrs. Shim mentioned, I'm running a Korean version of my study in Korea, and I'm also running an English version of my study in the United States. So I'll have 1,000 participants in Korea and another 1,000 in the States. So we can look at both within cultural, what's happening within the two cultures, and also what's happening between the two cultures. So basically my question is, what information do Koreans rely on most? What information do they privilege when they're determining the identity of ambiguous others, right? So are they relying most on blood information, on looks information, or language information? For Korea, my hypothesis is this. It's that blood information will be privileged most, followed by looks, and then finally language. So in Korea, why do I think that blood information is the most important? Well, that goes back to this notion of Korean ethnic nationalism, or the 단일 민족 theory, right? And so this was a political ideology founded by Korean intellectuals and political leaders in the early 20th century. And what it was a bloodline theory of race that effectively declared the inferiority of those of mixed and foreign blood. Right? So at the time, I think this notion served a very protective function, right? It served to promote Korean solidarity at a time when the nation was being attacked by foreign influences. And moreover, it was rather fitting, because then Korea was more or less homogeneous. Today, however, I think that this notion is neither protective nor fitting. As I already mentioned, by the year 2050, it is predicted that 10% of the Korean population will be multiracial. And moreover, Korea is already the world's leader in international marriage. So I do concede that I think that the way in which Koreans think about race is changing, and it has changed quite a bit. But overall, I do think still this notion of ethnic nationalism is pretty thoroughly embedded in the Korean collective consciousness. And because of this reason, I think that blood information will be privileged most. So before I go into my own research, I want to present previous work that's been done in the field. So in 2011, Rocket and colleagues conducted this study in Germany, right? So they were interested in looking at the two variables, looks versus accent. As you know, I'm looking at blood, looks, and language, so the study is a little different, but you'll see how the study became kind of jumping off point for me. So again, they were interested in looks versus accents. So first, they wanted to test these two stimuli on their own. So they looked at looks information first, right? So they're wondering if on their own, is looks salient enough, is it meaningful enough for people to look at looks and say, oh, I can make a social categorization based on looks alone, right? So what they did was they gathered images of what they thought were prototypically German-looking people and then prototypically Italian-looking people. And then they asked, can participants meaningfully separate the two from each other, right? And so what they found was that this was the case, right? So time and time again, people would say, oh, person A is definitely German. And then they would say, person B is definitely Italian, right? So these visual cues were meaningful. It wasn't that some of the time people thought that person A was German and then other times people thought person B was German. No, it was consistently, reliably. Every time people said person A is definitely German and person B is definitely Italian, right? So the visual cue was meaningful. Next, they did the same thing. So they tested the audio cue, or the audio stimuli, which was, again, accent, right? So what they did was they had recordings using German as a base language. They had recordings of German being spoken with a German accent, and then German being spoken with an Italian accent. And here, again, this accent cue was meaningful, right? So every time they said, oh, the first recording is of a German speaker, and then they said the second recording is of an Italian speaker, right? So this isn't rocket science. I mean, we know that accent information can be meaningful. This was more of a pretest, because what they were really interested in is what happens when we combine this information, and not only what happens when we combine the information, but what happens when we cross-combine them, so that sort of conflicting information is presented to the participants, right? So what happens when we pair the German-looking face with the Italian-sounding accent, and what happens when we pair the Italian-looking face with the German-sounding accent, right? So here, what information do you think will be privileged? Is it going to be the accent or the look? So are people going to say, well, he looks German, but he's sounding Italian, so I think he's Italian? Or do you think participants said, well, he looks German even though he sounds Italian, so he's actually German. So what do you guys think? Accent? Okay, well, yeah, you guys were right. It was exactly accent information that was privileged. So this study was called Blinded by the Accent, the Minor Role of Looks in Ethnic Categorization. And what the researchers said of their work was that when ethnic cues of looks and accents were combined by creating cross-categories, there was a clear predominance of accents as meaningful cues for categorization. Now, I'm not running this study here in Korea. If I were to, I would imagine that the opposite would be true. So I would say that Koreans would privilege looks over accent information. But as I said, I'm not running this study here. I'm looking at blood versus language versus looks, right? So I'm running a series of 4 studies to really get at how this interaction takes place. So in study 1, I'm pitting blood against language. In study 2, I'm pitting looks against language. In study 3, it's blood against looks. And then finally, in study 4, I have blood against looks against language. So I don't have time to go through all of my studies. And currently my studies are ongoing, so I don't have data to present to you either, and I apologize for that. But I'm going to go through study 1, the blood versus language study, to kind of give you an idea of what my participants would be doing, right? So again, blood versus language. So in the context of my studies, you can have one of 3 blood types. You can either be 100% Korean, 50% Korean, or 0% Korean. So you might be wondering, how do I present this information to my participants? What I do is I give them a simple sentence, right? So in the first case, I would say person A, or both of person A's biological parents are Korean. In the second case, I would say one of person A's or person B's biological parents is Korean, and the other is not. And finally, in the last case, I would say something like neither of person C's biological parents is Korean. So that's how blood information is delivered. Next, language information. So again, I'm not looking at accents. I think that would be really interesting to look at, but that's not what I'm doing in my present work. I'm looking at whether or not people speak Korean or don't. So either you're a native speaker of Korean or you don't speak Korean at all. So when I combined the blood and the language information, I'm interested in 4 specific profiles. And those profiles look like this, right? So person A is someone who is 100% Korean by blood, but he can't speak Korean at all, right? So who would this be in sort of real life? Maybe this person is a Korean American, right? So biologically, this person has 2 Korean parents, but he was born and raised in America, and for whatever reason, he never learned Korean, so he doesn't speak Korean. Alternatively, it could be maybe a Korean adoptee, same situation, 2 biologically Korean parents, but he or she never learned Korean. Secondly, I'm interested in 2 types of 50% Korean people, or half Koreans. In the first case, I'm looking at a Korean, a half Korean, who is a native speaker of Korean. So that could be perhaps a Tamuna individual, right? 1 Korean parent, 1 non-Korean parent. But that person was born and raised in Korea and is a native speaker of Korean. Alternatively, I'm looking at, again, a 50% Korean, 50% non-Korean, who doesn't speak Korean at all. So I think we might know people like this, right? Someone who has 1 Korean parent, 1 non-Korean parent, maybe they were raised in the States or elsewhere, and they just never learned Korean, so they don't speak Korean. Finally, probably what I think is the rarest of cases, it's when you're 0% Korean in terms of blood, but you're a native speaker of Korean, right? So again, I do think that this is the rarest of cases, but these people certainly do exist, right? I mean, if you've been to Severance Hospital, I know, I went there recently, and there is a Caucasian man. I think he's a doctor, and he's a native speaker of Korean. He might not even speak English or another language, but I think you know who I'm talking about.
Fourth generation.
Yeah, there we go. So these are the 4 specific profiles that I'm interested in. And so what I do is either I give one of these profiles to my participants and I ask them, to what extent do you think this person is Korean? Or I pit 2 profiles against each other, and I'm interested in the comparison, right? So who among the 2 is more Korean in this case? So I'm interested in 3 specific comparisons. The first comparison is the full Korean by blood, right? So let's say the Korean adoptee or the Korean American who doesn't speak Korean versus the 0% Korean by blood who speaks native Korean. So in this case, who is more Korean? What information will be privileged? Is the fact that this 0% Korean, is the fact that he can speak Korean like a native speaker more important than the fact that the other person has 100% Korean blood but doesn't speak Korean at all? Or is the opposite true? So these are the sort of comparisons that I'm looking at. Okay, so there's a problem with asking these sorts of questions, right? How Korean is a person? Who is more Korean? These are pretty loaded questions, right? And there's this natural desire, it's called the social desirability bias, to look good in front of other people. And you do that by answering questions in a politically correct way, right? Or you answer questions in a way that you think you should answer those questions. So in order to get around this problem of social desirability, we need to ask our questions about Koreanness in more indirect ways. And so personally, I'm doing that in two ways. First, I'm looking at how participants distribute limited resources. And second, I'm looking at how they make causal attributions. So what does this mean? Let me give you an example. First, with the distribution of limited resources. In a certain condition, I may present my participants with two profiles, right? And then I'll say, both person A and person B has applied for a Korean passport. Unfortunately, there's only one Korean passport remaining. Who would you give the last Korean passport to? So in this way, I hope to get at who participants think is really Korean or how they understand and define Koreanness. And again, a more indirect way, but hopefully in a more kind of real or true way. So I present my participants with a series of scenarios like these. Second, with causal attributions. So, for example, I present again my participant with a scenario, right? So in one case, it may be an antisocial scenario. So that basically means I'm saying that the person in the profile committed a murder, right? And so then we ask our participants, why do you think this person committed a murder? So it's already been established in the psychology literature that when you consider the actor, the murderer, an in-group member, so if I'm Korean, I would consider other Koreans in-group members, then you attribute the cause to external factors, right? So you say, oh, well, the person committed the act because he had to. He was protecting himself. He was provoked first, right? On the other hand, if you ask that very same question and the actor is considered an out-group member, you're more likely to attribute the cause of the act to internal causes, right? So you would say something like, oh, that person is inherently violent, or it's in his nature to be aggressive. That's why he committed the murder. And so again, in the second indirect way, I hope to get at a more sort of true idea of what Koreanness is and who is included in that category of Korean. So up until now, I talked about how I'm getting at this notion of Koreanness as a specific racial category. But I also mentioned earlier that I'm interested in how Koreans think about racial categories more broadly or more generally, right? So how do Koreans think about the nature of racial categories? Is race something that is fixed and static, or is it something that is more fluid and nebulous? So what psychologists do in order to measure this, in order to measure how people think about race, is they often measure what's called racial essentialism. Now, to give you the dictionary definition of this term, racial essentialism is the view that racial groups possess underlying essences that represent deep-rooted, unalterable traits and abilities. Now, I understand that this definition is somewhat convoluted, so what I'm going to do is actually show you some items that you might encounter if I were to measure your racial essentialism right now. So what I would do is I would give you statements like these, right? So one, to a large extent, a person's race biologically determines his or her abilities and traits. Or two, a person's race is something very basic about them and it can't be changed much. And so you would tell me the degree to which you either agree or disagree with statements like these. And I could thereby measure the degree to which you endorse racial essentialism. Now, you might be wondering why this matters or why this is bad. Is this bad? Is thinking about race in this kind of a way a bad thing? Well, it's been shown time and time again, study after study, that racial essentialism is a reliable predictor of stereotyping and discriminatory behavior, right? So that is a bad thing. If you think in this kind of way, you're more likely to stereotype, you're more likely to behave in discriminating ways. But I think the next question is actually, for whom is this bad? right? So if I think in racially sensuous ways and I discriminate against you, it's bad for you, but it's not bad for me, right? Not necessarily. So I was wondering, how can we come up with an argument that shows that racial essentialism, thinking in this way, is indeed both bad for you and for me, right? So we already know that racial essentialism positively predicts things like stereotyping and discrimination. But I was wondering if racial essentialism could also maybe negatively predict things that people care about, things that people value, things for me like morality and creativity. So these are just two sort of important values that I chose. Let me first clarify, when I talk about morality, I can be talking about a number of things from rule following, citizenship behavior, sharing, cooperation, but I'm particularly interested in what's called pro-social behavior, and that is basically the willingness to go out of your way to help another person, right? And this is regardless of in-group, out-group information. Because, I mean, it's natural to assume that you're going to be more likely to help in-group members, but I'm wondering, in general, are people who think in racially essentialist ways less likely to be helpful, just across the board? Secondly, I'm asking the same question of creativity. If you think in racially essentialist ways, are you less likely to be creative? And so this is the kind of connections and correlations that I'm trying to determine. As I mentioned before, I don't yet have data to present to you, and I don't think that the links between racial essentialism and pro-social behavior has been looked at. So hopefully this is something new that I can contribute to the literature. However, luckily for us, the links between racial essentialism and creativity have already been investigated. In a recent study in 2012, Tadmore and colleagues looked at this very correlation. And so what they did, you guys saw the racial essentialism measure, right? So they used that measure, and it included many different items, and they used that measure to measure the racial essentialism of their participants, right? So they got that done. And then next, they gave their participants a creativity measure. The creativity task that they use is called the Remote Associates Task, or the RAT task. And this has been used for decades in the creativity literature. So in this task, you're given a limited amount of time, usually something like 2 to 5 minutes, and you're asked to find the fourth word that ties a series of 3 otherwise unrelated words together. Right, so let's try some of these. So the first one is square, cardboard, and open. Does anyone know what the fourth word?
Fox.
Yeah, fox. Okay, and what about playing, credit, and report? Card, yes. And then finally, what about base, complex, and sleep?
Rhythm.
No, but that's a good guess. This is a hard one. They're actually getting increasingly harder. The answer to that final one is deep. So I just want to say before we move on, this is by no means the only way to measure creativity. It's just one way to measure creativity. And I think that this task is admittedly very hard. I mean, I'm horrible at this. So just because you don't do well on this task does not mean that you're not creative. But this is just the way in which these researchers looked at creativity. And so, indeed, what they found was that endorsing racial essentialism predicted stagnated or lowered creativity. The title of their paper was called Not Just for Stereotyping Anymore, Racial Essentialism Reduces Domain General Creativity. Right? So as I said, we already knew that racial essentialism predicted things like stereotyping and discriminatory behavior, but what these researchers found was that it also predicted lowered creativity. To summarize their work, they said, although these two concepts, racial essentialism and creativity, concern very different outcomes, they both occur when people fixate on existing category information and on conventional mindsets. So for me, as a multiracial individual myself, my mother is Korean, my father is Italian-American, I feel very viscerally that multiracial individuals don't neatly fit into pre-existing racial categories. And as such, we sort of challenge conventional notions of race. But whether or not you're multiracial, whether you're in a minority group or a majority group, whether you're on the receiving end of racism or the perpetrating end, I hope that I've shown, and I hope that I continue to show through my studies, that it really does matter how we think about race. Now, I hope this doesn't seem too abrupt, but I'm actually going to conclude talking about my lab work. So this is all the work that I've been doing in the lab. Yonsei University's Social and Cultural Psychology Lab. All of the work that I'm doing here is quantitative, it's empirical, but I've also been pursuing another project while I've been in Korea. And this is a more qualitative project. It is a sort of interviewed photography project. And because all of my work in the lab was really focused on the Korean perspective, right? So how do these, quote, native Koreans perceive their multiracial counterparts? I was also really interested in the perspectives and experiences of multiracial individuals themselves. So what I did was I met up with so far 18 multiracial individuals living and working in Korea. I would like to do at least 2 more before my grant period is up. But in any case, so far I've met up with 18 individuals. I've interviewed them and I've also photographed them. But before I show you my own work, I want to talk about 2 artists and their work, because I think they've kind of set the precedent. They've kind of done some really seminal work in terms, as far as kind of multi-ethnic, multiracial identity projects go. And the first is the work of the American artist Kip Fulbright. And he did what's called the HAPA project. This was done in the early 2000s. And what he did was he traveled around the States, and he recruited those who self-identify as HAPA. HAPA is the Hawaiian word for part or half, and it basically refers to those who are multiracial, usually those who have Asian or Pacific Islander heritage. So in addition to photographing his subjects, as you can see in this very standardized way, right, from the shoulders up, bare, against a white background, he also asked his subjects to respond to the question, what are you? And so underneath their portraits are the subjects' responses, right? And I love, for me personally, I love the kids' responses. I think they're kind of the most creative and the most provocative. But so as you can see here, this girl says, I'm a person, and she draws a picture of a girl, and she has, the word star on her shirt. And then on the bottom, actually, in printed words are actually the sort of the real ethnic or racial identity of these individuals, right? So the person in the middle, he says, I'm 100% black and 100% Japanese. And so people are interpreting this question, what are you, in their own kind of nuanced ways. So the girl here, she says, what am I? Shouldn't you be asking my name first? Or the guy in the middle, is one of my favorites, he says, I'm part Chinese and part Danish. I don't usually tell people that I'm Danish, though, because they usually think I'm a pastry. So, and then just to show you, right, and then so the guy here, he says, what am I? I'm exactly the same as every other person in 2,500. And then, of course, this is my favorite one right here, the one in the middle. I think he had it right. Okay, so this is the work of the American artist that I wanted to share with you. Next, I wanted to share with you the work of a Korean photographer. His name is Lee Jae-gup, and what he did was he photographed Amerasians. Now, Amerasians are demographically different from those of Tamuna individuals. Amerasians were born to Korean mothers and American GIs. And so they were born around the time of the Korean War, so during the 1950s and 60s. They experienced a lot of discrimination, a lot of hardship. I think, one, because they had more salient, kind of different phenotypic features, right? Whereas Tamuna individuals, many people say that they are sort of passable as Korean. They can pass physically as Korean. Although, again, once blood information is introduced, that sort of changes the story. But again, for the Amerasians, they were more physically different. Their physical difference is more salient, I would say. And also, there's a lot of a stigma attached to them because of the perceived union of their parents, or the perceived ways in which their parents were joined. I guess the nature of their unions, right, is considered to be sort of immoral or unkosher. But anyways, Lee Jae-gup, he went around the country and he photographed these Amerasians in the early 1990s. So that was one project that he did. The second project that he did that I'm also very interested in is this Chumingdungnok series, right? So again, he photographed Amerasians, and he also photographed their Chumingdungnok cards, or what's, I guess we can call in English, their social security cards, or resident registration cards, right? And so he created a sort of typology, as you can see here. Now, for me, I am, of course, admittedly indebted to both of these artists, and I think anyone, even whether or not you knew about these artists or not, if you're doing this kind of work, you're always going to come sort of after the legacy of these artists and their works. So definitely want to pay my respects to them. And then now I'm going to show you some of my own work, some of my own photographs. As I mentioned, I've so far photographed 18 individuals, and I hope to photograph more. I know some of you are here, so thank you for coming. And then I interviewed my subjects as well. I don't have time today to talk about all of my interviewees, so I'm actually only going to focus on one, simply because I think there's an interesting relationship between what this individual had to say and the work that I'm doing in the lab. So I'm going to talk about this individual here. And if you are interested in reading more about my interviews, we have a Fulbright blog called Wireless Peninsula, and I write about my interviews there. And a lot of other great work by other Fulbrighters are on that blog as well. So please check it out if you're interested. So, okay, about a month ago, I wrote this post called Sounding Korean, Looking Other, and it was again based on this individual. So let me just start off by saying that this person is half Korean, his mother is Korean, his father is Caucasian American. He was born and raised in the States. And his Korean is impeccable. It's flawless. I think Mrs. Shim can attest to that. I remember the first time I heard him speak in Korean, my jaw dropped because everything from his accent, his sort of hand gestures, mannerism, if I can say, it's perfectly Korean. What's really interesting about him, though, is that he actually didn't learn Korean until he was in college, right? So he didn't grow up learning Korean. His mother didn't speak Korean to him. He did, however, had a close relationship with his Korean grandmother, and he expressed his frustration because whenever he tried to communicate with her, he couldn't. And so someone like his mom or another family member had to be a sort of translator or mediator. So he said because of this reason, during his undergraduate career, he decided to come to Korea and learn Korean. So he studied abroad for a year, and he learned Korean. He came back for another summer, took more language classes, and then eventually he was a Fulbright researcher a few years ago here in Korea. He took on a few internships, a few jobs, and he currently works in the green tech industry here in Korea. And again, his Korean is so good that when I asked him to talk about his work, he said that he couldn't do it in English. Right? He was more comfortable talking about his work in Korean than he was in English. So we ended up not talking about his work. But anyways, so I asked him, in Korea, do people see you as Korean? And at first he said no. It was a very hard no. But then he kind of retracted his answer and he said, well, when there's no image involved, they Koreans think I'm Korean. When they see my face, however, their reaction automatically changes. So what's good, I think, is that so far, this is very much in line with what I'm doing in the lab, right? So I think that while I'm not saying that language information is not important, I think looks information is more important than language information, right? And I think we kind of see an example of that here, where when people just listen to this person speaking, maybe they're on the phone or for whatever reason, when just his voice can be heard, he sounds Korean, people think he's Korean. However, once his face enters into the equation, people automatically change the way that they think about him. Now, what's really great about doing this sort of qualitative work is that I think I can kind of get a more nuanced or more personal understanding of how at least this individual thinks about this relationship between looks and blood and language, right? Because I don't think that I would be able to get this kind of information through the empirical studies that I'm running. But anyways, he went on to talk about what he thought about this whole relationship. And he said to me that because he speaks Korean so well, because he speaks Korean so convincingly, he often kind of inevitably gets the answer, or gets the question, why do you speak Korean so well, right? If you don't look Korean, if you're not Korean, why do you speak Korean so well? So he says that he gives what he calls the easy answer. He says, I'll just tell people I'm half Korean, so they'll get off my back about why I'm so good at Korean. And then he went on further to say that it's so ingrained within Koreans that Korean is too difficult to learn, that if you're that good at Korean, there's no way you could not be Korean. So again, there's this really interesting, really nuanced relationship between how you look, how well you can speak Korean, and what your blood is. And this is just his opinion, and maybe you agree with him, maybe you don't agree with him. In any case, I'm sticking with the fact that for me, language isn't as important. I think that language won't be as privileged, won't be deemed as important as far as the majority of Koreans Koreans go when they're determining the identity of ambiguous others. And I was really, I am committed to that idea, although I have to say I'm really shaken, and I'm shaken in particular by this comment that was written on this post. So this guy named Charles, this blogger named Charles, responded to my post, and he writes, "Fascinating post, and something I can relate to in a way. I am 100% white, some would say extremely white, but I've lived in Korea for a while and speak Korean well. Earlier this month, I was having lunch with my wife, who is Korean. Oh, well, that explains it, the fact that he can speak Korean so well. And we were speaking in Korean. At one point, a man sitting at the table next to me turned and asked in Korean, 'Excuse me, are you Korean?' I was dumbfounded by this and eventually managed to answer, no. The man nodded and said, 'It's just that you speak Korean so well. I'm still not sure what to make of this.' I'm not sure what to make of this either. This goes directly against my hypothesis that language information is not important. Here is this extremely white person being asked if he's Korean in Korean. So who knows, maybe my hypothesis will be proven to be completely incorrect. In any case, once I get my data, I hope to share that with you. But for now, we don't know. Before I conclude, I want to say thank you so much to my advisor and my lab mates at Yonsei University Social and Cultural Psychology Lab. Also, a big thanks to my other affiliate, the MAC Foundation, which stands for the Movement for the Advancement of the Cultural Diversity of Koreans. They do a lot of great work with Talmuna kids and tutoring, mentoring, also fundraising. I'm also very grateful to two Fulbright ETAs, Mary Han and Dan Sova, who helped me sort of revise and edit my studies. And finally, I'm very grateful to my good friend back at home, who actually originally created this image for the series finale of Breaking Bad, and she allowed me to appropriate her image for my own presentation. So thank you to her, thank you to all of you for being here. Thanks for your time and attention. Sorry, can I make one quick announcement? I'm running a quick pre-test. It will take 3 minutes. So I need volunteers. I need 10 English-speaking. If you're a native English speaker and you would like to help me, can you just hang on? And also, I need 4 native Korean-speaking volunteers. So if after I take questions, if you can just chill for 3 minutes, I just need your help. Please help me. So, questions? Yes, sir.
Do you encounter a high level, or what you would consider to be a high level of essentialism here?
I don't have all my data yet, but I can say that something that's kind of similar to racial essentialism is what's called the need for cognitive closure. And I know that in general, Koreans are quite high on this measure. So based on that, I could predict that essentialism might be high as well, but I can't say for certain. Yes?
Go ahead. Okay. Do you think that it's possible, like, your categories are so rigidly defined as blood information, which is basically like heritage, knowledge about heritage, right? Mm-hmm. And then phenotype and language information. Mm-hmm. But do you think it's possible, like, for instance, those last 2 examples that sort of break down those categories, that when people think about race, that they're not actually thinking in such rigid categories? So for instance, like the way that like language and heritage are not necessarily separable in, like, for instance, like the sociological imagination of Koreans in general. So that's why you may have instances where you get like a cognitive disconnect.
Yeah.
So I don't know, I guess like as a researcher, that's something that you might want to consider. It's like, you're saying that these are rigid categories and that people process this information this way, but I would be willing to bet that like the way that people process racial information is much more fluid.
Yeah. And I think that's part of the reason why I personally kind of feel a need for conducting sort of qualitative research as well as quantitative research, because I think it's just logistically harder to get at those kinds of notions through quantitative means. I mean, it is possible, but it's harder, I think. So, yes. Yeah.
I was just wondering why you chose both morality and creativity.
Okay. So basically, I'll go back to that slide. Yes, the question was why I chose specifically creativity and morality. So I sort of explained to you our reasoning, right? Wait, where did that? Here. So we wanted to show that thinking in racially essentialist ways could possibly predict having sort of lowered, in general, good things, right? So morality and creativity are good things. And what I actually did was I came up with a list of things that I thought people valued across the board. So that included things like, you know, subjective well-being, health, physical health, mental health, intelligence, productivity, and morality and creativity were among those. I personally am interested in creativity. I think I'm just kind of intrinsically motivated to pursue this. I think that there's something important and fascinating about it. To be honest, morality, I'm not that interested in morality. But my advisor is a big morality researcher, and he suggested that might be a good thing to study. I'm not saying that morality is not important. Morality is important. I just don't think that I'm a very moral person, so, okay. I think that, let's just say morality is important. So that's why I chose these two. Next question, please. Yes.
It's timely and important research. But I think along with the comment that was mentioned here, I would encourage, and it could be a disciplinary difference coming out of anthropology, but it's not entirely clear sometimes when you're talking about your really interesting presentation. Are you talking about the categories that they're using, or that you actually, do you agree with them or not? So in other words, are these categories really that discrete? I think sometimes the challenge in my own work as well is, language. I like how you unpacked it here, but language and heritage and blood in particular, I think, is it really, can you really parse those categories out to just the way they speak or their accent? Not to mention, even with the Korean context, I think you're saying, even in your own presentation, I just like you're saying pure Korean, I think you want to be mindful that even within the Korean context, there's a lot of debates over accent itself, and then standard Korean versus this and that.
Yeah.
And I think finally, just my last question actually, because I'm actually very interested in racial ideas of racial formation categories, both in the American and Korean context, I think is maybe I would kind of nudge toward, and I don't know if this is your direction at all, but the centrality of whiteness within the category of American or even Korean, I would argue to some extent. For instance, you mentioned in your study you had some example of German-looking faces. I would encourage, what exactly in the Korean, among the informants you're talking to, what do they mean by that? And I would argue that within that is, the notion of heritage and language and, that's your challenge, I guess, is trying to parse that out. But I think within the presentation, sometimes it felt kind of like there's a risk in redefining that, that they are so discrete when the way people are talking about it qualitatively, as you said, it's so messy. So I would just kind of say, I'd be really happy to talk to you about, how are you exactly, trying to identify and measure those things? I think that would be my question.
Yeah. So thank you for your question. You said a lot of really great, important things, and I don't actually know where to begin because you said quite a bit. But I think I would say first that I didn't use the term pure Korean, but I would definitely hesitate to use that term. I did say the term native Korean, and I hesitate to say that term as well, even though I did use that term, and I put native in quotation marks. And I specifically define native Korean as someone who is both ethnically and racially Korean. And I know that there are problems with that. But again, for the purpose of my study, I feel that I kind of need to make these sort of discrete, concrete definitions and categorizations. And I know that it's hard to do, but I feel that it's necessary to do in order to be able to measure these things. I feel that I'm presenting a very sort of simplistic view of what all of these things are. But at the same time, as I said, I feel like that's kind of the only way I know to go as to going about it and getting to what these things mean in Korea. If you know a better way, please share with me. Yeah, and I don't think I definitely did not address all of your comments and statements. So yeah,
There's practicality, and I still think it's fascinating.
thank you. So hopefully we can talk more about that later. Do we have time or? Yeah. Okay, Michael.
I had a question last comment, but I want to jump off of his centrality of whiteness thing to another question. I have friends who are biracial, whether Korean and white American, who identify very strongly as Korean, to the point where there's pressure on me to speak Korean with people. And I don't want to do that because I identify very strongly just as American, and my native language is English. But what I always tell these people is it's easier for you to be seen or considered by certain people who know you as Korean, who give you that leeway. But they don't do that for people of black descent at all. And I felt that in my experience. I wonder if you've come across that question in your subjects.
I'm sorry. Can you repeat the last part?
So basically, you have more leeway to be seen as Korean.
If you're white, if you're half white.
If you're half white.
Yeah.
Basically.
So have I seen that with my subjects that I've interviewed? Is that the question? Yeah. No, I haven't, simply because I have yet to interview a half Korean, half black, or half black individual. However, I will say that I'll interview you. I know that, but I want to say that I agree with what you're saying. I can see that. I think part of it is maybe not simply, but a part of it could be a phenotype thing, right? If you're half Korean, half white, maybe it's again more easy for you to pass as Korean, whereas that might be harder if you're half black, half Korean. I don't want to make a generalized statement about that, but perhaps that is the case. But there's so much more. There's so much more to it than that, right? White privilege and all of this. So I know you have a lot to say about that.
Well, I won't say that.
Okay. Can I take another question? Yes.
I wonder if there's not a connection between legal institutions and essentialism, because in society at large, it's very easy enough for these categories to be fairly fluid, but if you're talking about the legal discriminatory regime where one category is privileged, there needs to be some basis to decide whether you're in or whether you're out. And so the Jim Crow South, you've got the one drop rule.
Yes.
In South Africa, the category you're in is what is on your ID card. At that point, those things become very fixed, and I would think that would feed back into how people think about race. I'm wondering whether there's anything in the research that would back that up.
That's a really interesting point, and I wish I could answer that question, but I don't know. In Korea, I think that. Well, it's interesting, I think, to look at sort of like the status of Amerasians as compared to those of the Tamuna individuals. And I think that the Tamuna individuals are granted much more sort of benefits, status in terms of citizenship than the Amerasians. This is just my hunch. I don't have any sort of qualitative data to back this up. But I think that perhaps because of that, because they are sort of maybe in some sense protected by the government, protected by their legal status, there is more acceptance if we were to compare the two groups. That's all I can really say. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time.
Can I ask 2 questions?
We can talk after.